Hello, everybody. I'm Suzanne Pollack, Director of Development for Charleston Literary Festival. I first want to have special thanks to our sponsors today, David Trachtenberg, Rick Wilson, Cheryl and Peter Teague, and also a very special thanks to Rick and David for housing Diana Reich and Peter Reich for 4 years in their beautiful carriage house. Thank you, Rick and David. I am honored to introduce Rachel Kushner and Autumn Phillips. Rachel is a daughter of 2 scientists. Her mother arranged after-school work for her at 5 years old, straightening and alphabetizing books at a feminist bookstore. If you're going to start that young, you know you're just going to have to be a reader. A writer. When Rachel was 16, she began her bachelor's degree in political economy at the University of California, Berkeley, with an emphasis on United States foreign policy in Latin America. Rachel's first novel, Telex from Cuba, published in 2008, was a finalist for the 2008 National Book Award. Rachel's second novel, The Flamethrowers, published in 2013, was a finalist for the 2013 National Book Award and named a top book in 2013 by the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Oprah Magazine, New York Book Review, Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Vogue, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. Rachel's third novel, The Mars Room, published in 2018, was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. And today, Rachel's latest novel, Creation Lake, is shortlisted for the 2024 Booker Prize, and she's going to London tomorrow for that. Autumn Phillips is editor-at-large for the Post and Courier, recently retired as editor-in-chief. During her 7 years at the paper, the Post and Courier grew dramatically from a low-country paper to a statewide publication. The Public Service and Investigative Fund was launched, which has generated donor support for investigative reporting, including the Uncovered Project, the Education Lab, and the Rising Water Lab. Since her college days, Autumn has traveled far and wide, often solo, always solo, to places where most people do not go. She currently sponsors transformative group trips, during which she teaches participants how to write about their journey as a way of deepening the experience. I have been with Autumn on amazing trips to Lebanon, Cuba, and Morocco, and I highly recommend them. Autumn has just returned on Sunday from Sri Lanka and Algeria. So now let's listen to these very cool women discuss this prize-winning book. Thank you.
All right, if you don't mind, before I start asking you questions, could you talk a little bit about the shape of this novel for people who haven't read it, this interchange between Bruno and Sadie?
Sure. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Autumn, for doing this. It's exciting to be in South Carolina. So this novel, Creation Lake, is it's about for those who have not read the book, it is about a 34-year-old woman who is on assignment in rural France. And she is somebody who previously worked for the American FBI, is basically a disgraced former private eye.
Fired.
Who entrapped a young man who was an eco-activist, and she was told to produce evidence that he and his friends were planning sabotage. She couldn't find the evidence. This boy was very sweet on her, and she let him know that they would have a relationship, they would sleep together, but as part of their courtship, he was going to first buy 500 pounds of nitrate fertilizer. And he ends up going to prison, but then his lawyer proves entrapment through a Freedom of Information Act, and his conviction is overturned. The feds, as she puts it, touch a button and their tinted windows go up, and that's it for her. And she is released into the unregulated, shadowy world of privately contracted surveillance spies. She is on assignment in France as this book opens, and she's on her way to infiltrate a group of young French people who've decamped from Paris. They're like college-educated people with kind of politically ultra-left ideals who have built a commune, who are learning how to farm, who want to build relationships with the local farmers in the community. And she's been assigned to basically go there, be an agent provocateur, set them on a collision course with the French state, get them raided by the French police, and at the same time, she's also more or less tasked with knocking off a French politician. So she has to bring that all together. The politician is, for people who know French politics, is quite clearly inspired by a particular real individual, which is Manuel Valls. But the thing is, Manuel Valls was Prime Minister of France, and I don't think I had I didn't have it in me to knock off a prime minister. So I heavily demoted my French politician to deputy sub-minister of the Ministry of Rural Coherence. Everyone laughs at that. It's not a real ministry, but it might as well be, because it's a combination of two different ministries which are meant to sort of initiate large-scale industrial projects that benefit corporate farming. So in terms of the structure, the group, the commune, they're called Le Moulin, just the mill, has a mentor who is a man in his 80s. His name is Bruno Lacombe. He's French. I see him as the kind of personality who I think of as a refugee of the long 20th century. He was born before World War II, lost his family in the war. His father was a resistance fighter, was shot by the milice. His mother was Jewish. She was killed in a concentration camp, along with 14 other of his relatives, including his only sibling. He washes up on the streets of Paris, gets involved with Guy Debord, and the situation is very shaped by the rebellions in May of 1968 on the streets of Paris. But by the time this novel begins, is somebody who has decided that capitalism is absolutely here to stay and has given up on the sort of delusion of a revolution, but has decided that, in fact, consciousness and the inner self can be revolutionized. And he is writing long communiques to the group, which Sadie has cracked into because he is writing them via email. And so as the book opens, she's reading his emails, but the reader is also reading them. So everything that you hear from Bruno is transposed through Sadie's voice because she's the first person speaker in the book.
Right. So we're going back and forth between what's somewhat of a traditional spy novel and this treatise on prehistory and politics and capitalism. So, so the spy. Let's talk about the spy piece of it.
Sure.
First. So I thought a lot about, as I was reading, the trope or the literary device of the spy.
Yeah.
And why we like that person so much. And there's a scene where Sadie, and we're going to call her Sadie because we never do learn her real name.
She's using the alias Sadie for the sake of the particular job that she's commissioned to complete over the occasion of this novel.
Right. So she's buying wine, and as she's buying wine, she decides she's also going to steal some terrine.
Well, should I read that part?
Yeah. And
not give it away. Since Autumn had very carefully selected passages. But if you have more intro you want to do first.
Well, I was just going to say that as I was reading this section, I had this epiphany that this is why we like spy novels. This is why we like the character of the spy, because they, at least they think, they know more than we do. Go ahead.
No, that's true. And maybe I'll say more about that after. Should I read the passage?
Yeah.
Okay. So Sadie she's on her way to the commune as the book opens, and she's been stopping at truck stops along the auto route to drink regional wines, and she says that that's her way of experiencing like the different localities of France, is to have a Luberon, from a Monop off the A55 and etc. I care about fine wine, but not about food. And because the terrine is efficient, comes in its own container, and can be consumed unheated, I stole 2 jars of it from one of these travel centers, the weight of the jars giving a new tug to the leather straps of my handbag as I purchased my wine. It wasn't that I believed the wine I bought was payment enough for my jars of human cat food. She earlier has this disquisition about the terrine tasting like cat food, but which French people eat as though it were not cat food. Stealing is a way to stop time. Also, it refocuses the mind, the senses, if they become dulled, for instance, by drinking. Stealing puts reality into sharper relief. You're in a highway travel center, people in a great flux and flow, coming and going and milling and choosing. The cashier's in a fugue state of next and next and next. And in order to locate the precise moment when you can take unseen, you slow it all down. You make time stop. You insert into reality what composers call a fermata, and while time is stopped, you put something in your bag. In this way, I test my fitness. I test my ability to see. I gauge what other people see, and also what they fail to see. So yeah, and I'm sure that she is skilled at taking the terrine, and I've known people over the years who have made very similar claims about theft, and I think that it is a way of feeling like you can become hypersensitized to the situation in a room and what other people are doing. Everyone's turned away from you, and there's almost like a granular slowing down when the theft occurs. But to your larger point, Sadie is someone who thinks that she can sense in all other people weaknesses in them that they themselves cannot sense. The spy, maybe classically, as I understand it, is a figure who illuminates the map of the novel over its course and can put together clues and produce finally a portrait that they share with the reader. But in this case, Sadie is more of a disgraced detective than a spy, so that what she's hired to do is to manipulate other people and destroy their lives. She wants the police to come in and raid the commune because that's what she's been hired to do. She's basically going to knock off this politician, or that's what they end up asking her to do. So she is somebody who rigs a situation rather than discovers through clues a manner of illuminating its larger meaning. She's not really concerned with larger meaning. She tells the reader more or less that she's a perfectionist who doesn't make mistakes, but then she also seems to drink quite heavily over the course of the novel. She deposits her trash everywhere she goes. She's staying in the country house of this young man who believes that she and he are in a relationship, that they're in love, when in fact, as she says to the reader, because she does disclose certain things to the reader that she doesn't to the people in the book, she says he's in love with a woman who doesn't exist because he doesn't know anything about her, and she's just given him some kind of lazy breadcrumbs that for him work as a portrait of who she actually is. So she's staying in this house that belongs to his family, and she fills the downstairs living room with her empty wine bottles and empty beer cans. And when that room is full, she just closes the pocket doors and starts depositing her trash in the room that is the mirror image across the hall. And she says, I have no reason ever to clean up because I will never return to the same place twice.
Right. Let's talk about that relationship.
Doesn't really seem like a sustainable way to live.
No.
Just ontologically. Like if the world doesn't matter to you, how do you proceed without an existential crisis?
Right.
Because that's what our life is made of, right? Is care.
Yeah. Feels like she ends up in a pretty big existential crisis.
Later.
So let's talk about that relationship she has with this guy. So another trope, I guess, of the spy, or maybe this is more failed detective, but is sex, right? You've got the, James Bond's sexy character, sex as entree, right, to information. And she even talks about how the other woman who's in her world who refuses to have sex with people isn't as good. Anyway, but I thought this was a really interesting passage. I'm hoping you'll read about this relationship and about, I feel like you upend that idea of the sexy spy.
Right. I forgot it. So she describes this woman who she's seen who has had her identity exposed by activists so that she can no longer work in that world. And Sadie's sort of critiquing the other spies and the mistakes that they've made. And she describes this woman as looking obviously like a narc and having quote unquote ROTC shoulders, which seemed particularly ungenerous. There's another spy she describes, a male spy, who has had affairs with many of the women that he's been surveilling. And
Too many.
Sorry?
Too many.
Right. Like, he is actually was based on a real person, and that was how I knew that these people exist that have sort of been disgraced and disappeared into the private sector is through a couple of different examples. There was an FBI agent in the US who kind of did what Sadie does, which is that she manipulated this young guy into having a relationship with her and then convinced him that in order to, take him seriously, he needed to take the cause seriously. And to take the cause seriously, he needed to help her buy the components to build a bomb. And he was a young guy, and he did that, and he was sentenced and convicted to 21 years in federal prison. I know people who know this guy. He served 9 years in prison before a judge overturned his conviction. This UK police officer had affairs with like 9 or 10 different women in these groups, and then was found out. And several of these women have sued the Metropolitan UK Police, and it's been a huge scandal for the British police. This spy has countersued the UK police for quote unquote failing to protect him from falling in love. So Sadie points to that case as if to say, this guy is really sloppy. So she herself only has an affair with one member of the group she's infiltrating, and she does that just to, she says, inside of your guises, you can meet real needs. In the case of the boyfriend, she has no feelings for him whatsoever, but sort of forces herself to sleep with him when she can no longer put it off. I would be gone, my work here completed, before Lucien was done with his film shoot in Marseille. His plan for an eventual honeymoon, his expression, in the Guyenne would vanish like his delusion that he'd known me. But these thoughts, my own actual thoughts of Lucien breathing all over me, might remain. I might be stuck with the memory of him rolling me toward him at the hotel in Marseille, overpowering me and pinning me down in a manner he was convinced was right and good for both of us. Revisiting that, unable to block it, I wondered if I was getting paid sufficiently for this work. Things can be renegotiated based on the unexpected, the challenges that crop up. I have always been a good negotiator. What amount would be enough? Know your worth. Know your salt. Know their salt. Proceed accordingly. Few could do what I do. Name a price, I told myself. But thinking of Lucien's hands all over me like I was a book of Braille and he was a blind man, insisting on reading this book, running his hands up and down my arms and legs and over my stomach and breasts, not to read me, but to force me to pretend I wanted to be touched like that, I could not come up with a number.
I know. She's amazing. So you've created this character in Sadie that I guess we were talking about it earlier, the cool girl, or what you call the honorary man, or she sees herself as the honorary manner, getting power because men accept her. But at the same time, she's also this very vulnerable character because she's working corporate bosses she's never met. She's alone.
Yeah.
Nobody gives a shit about her. What kind of a person were you creating with her? What kind of a woman? What did you learn about?
Yeah, it's an interesting set of questions that all come together. So yeah, I in terms of her being like a tough girl, her voice has a sort of brutality to it almost. Yeah. She's very blunt. Her bluntness can sometimes lead to fun occasions for humor for me. Mm-hmm. So she was a good outlet for sort of like my own, maybe kind of slightly juvenile sense of humor on occasion. But, you know, the part of writing novels is figuring out how to maximize your strengths, you know, or like dilate the dynamism that is you. You have to do what you can do. And her humor is a component of me. The rest of her is so different than me. I mean, the world that she is headed toward and wants to destroy is a world for which I would naturally have great sympathy and do. I mean, the reason I'm able to write about this kind of project of young people who've decamped from Paris to build a commune is that I know people who have done this and in fact have been raided by the police, you know, and one of them was raided by was infiltrated by this very guy, the one who had all the affairs with women, this British agent. And I asked people, like, didn't you know this guy was a cop? Because you look at the pictures of him and he just looked like a lost person who would reinvent himself according to the sort of aesthetic dictates of the people he's among. Like when he was with German climate activists, he's a white guy who like had dreadlocks and wore like Guatemalan hippie surf pants. And then suddenly he's hanging out with the French people who are the people I know. Mm-hmm. And they're very much like black bloc kind of anti-globalization protesters from the early 2000s who are very clean cut, kind of dressed in black, you know, just sort of conservative looking. And suddenly he had short hair and no earrings and was all in black. And I was saying like, didn't you guys know? And they said, no, we just sort of thought he was coming to his senses and getting a good style, you know? So, and they said, but also, you know, he had a van. So, you know, he had money. It's just, he allowed things to sort of work. Yeah. So where was I with that? In terms of Sadie, you know, she's a narc, which is something that I would like not to think that I am. But because I'm familiar with the world of the commune and the sort of social mores of it, I can depict it accurately. But by doing it through her eyes, it becomes a much more illuminating exercise because I have to look at what can withstand her amoral leveling gaze. You know, because she walks into the communal daycare at the commune and points out to the sort of de facto leader, Pascal, oh, well, you have a communal daycare, but, you know, the children that are here are all actually the children of the women that are here, and there are no men here. But her critique is not from a position of feminism. If anything, Sadie is a kind of misogynist, I think. And it was also me looking at that and sort of interrogating it, but secretly and from inside of it. It's as though she's a sort of tank that I've gotten into and I'm flipping the controls and learning how they work. And I think she's somebody who sees power as being fundamentally male. Yeah. So she's not really interested in the women in the commune and just focuses on the men and really blows off the women until this woman who has sort of been excommunicated for being loud, for having opinions. Also, she's middle-aged, you know, and so she doesn't really fit into what Pascal sees as the role of women in the commune, which isn't to say that they have to serve the men, but a kind of sort of OG woman who's come from another commune, Notre-Dame-de-Lande, which is a real place where they've had successes in preventing the French government from building a huge airport in an area that has been farmed for 1,000 years, and the farmers have said no to the airport. In any case, this woman shows up and she says to Sadie, pulls her aside like, listen, you need to pay attention to the women because, you know, you're angering them and they're going to be on to you if you don't show them some respect. And then Sadie goes swimming with the group at the river where they all jump off of this limestone shelf. And she's thinking, do I strip down to my bra and underwear like the girls here? She has fake breasts. She has this sort of perfect body that she uses as a tool. It's not something that she's sort of personally proud of. It's more like it's not quite hers. It's just one more thing, like the gun in her handbag. And she thinks, maybe I'll just keep my t-shirt and shorts on because she's being pressured by one of the women to jump off the cliff. And she says, the thing is, if I do jump in my bra and underwear, you know, it will please the men. But if you please the men, you will not necessarily please the women.
Right.
That said, you can please the women without necessarily displeasing the men.
Yeah.
If you follow that.
Yeah. That was memorable.
So in terms
scene.
of what kind of person she is, I think she's a person who, I mean, we only get to know her during a very discrete period of time. It's 6 weeks. And in terms of what was formally required for the book as its creator, by instinct, I felt having a very illuminating passage where Sadie suddenly jumps to her childhood and tells you where she's from and what kinds of things happen to her in ways that are meant to sort of account for who she is and why she's tough and makes the decisions she does and why she's in this profession didn't seem right to me.
Right.
So that was my instinct. But then when I stepped back and thought about it, I thought, you know, with Raymond Chandler and Marlowe, you also don't get those kinds of illuminations because the point isn't a character examination of the spy themselves.
Right.
But I do believe that we get some sense of who Sadie is. She shares as backstory previous jobs that she has undertaken. And that was kind of my rule, which is like when there's room for a flashback, Sadie's going to tell you about some other time when she set out to ruin people's lives. Like when she succumbs to an affair with, you know, one of the guys in the commune. He's the hot guy in the commune. Sadie has this rule where she says, the deeper you go into the French countryside, the higher the men wear their pants. And in the highest countryside, it's like up here above the sternum. This guy, as I picture him, is sort of in the middle. He's like kind of like 1950s hot. So she sleeps with this guy and she tells the reader that in the throes of intimacy, a scent like marijuana is released from his underarms. And for some people, that would kind of be like a grassy, innocent, wholesome scent. For Sadie, she likes it because it reminds her of the bust of a large grow facility she had once facilitated in Idaho. And so that tells you a little more about her, that she's somebody who thinks fondly of that other time she sent people to prison.
Yeah. You brought up Nadia, who's this other, female character, kind of another outsider. And for some reason in this book, I was constantly aware of the inside of the engines of the cars. Like I don't know if I've ever read a book that was so aware of the mechanics of things.
Really?
And the narrator seemed to judge people by how well they knew their vehicles. Anyway, there's a scene with Nadia where I thought she's this really, smart person who's going to tear it all down. She gave me a little anxiety. And then she gets in the car and she starts grinding the gears.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh no, she's not going to do any of that. Like you shut her down that fast. Anyway, I don't have a question. I just noticed that.
Yeah, no, it's true. She accidentally restarts the car when it's already started, and it makes that terrible sound. And then she accidentally puts it in fifth when she needs first.
Power away.
It's peening, and then she changes gears and goes into first, and it's in overdrive, and then finally they are on their way.
Yeah. One thing that you're really good at, like masterclass good at, is your descriptions of people. I'm trying to think of one. Frank, you're watching we're watching a documentary about this guy Frank, and you're like, Frank, the Amazon delivery driver wearing his Lamborghini baseball cap, or he had a guileless comb over was a line, or the TV producer.
It's Bruno Lacombe, who's really the main character of the book in a sense, because he speaks as much, if not more, than Sadie does. But she's reading his communiques. So at first you start with, Bruno told them, Bruno said, and then pretty soon there's like longer and longer passages of just Bruno speaking. Yeah. But Sadie has his book and she turns it over and looks at the back and there's an author photo of him. He's quite a mysterious man who lives in a cave basically and has rejected civilization almost to like he has decided, that the future involves engaging very seriously with prehistory and trying to let go of certain aspects of contemporary reality. I mean, Bruno describes our reality like this. He says, currently we are careening toward extinction in a shiny driverless car. And the question is, how do we exit this car? So his kind of voice gets into her head over the course of the novel. She turns over his book and looks at the back, and he has this comb over, and she said it wasn't meant to deceive anyone about how much hair he had or lacked, and rather was, I don't remember the exact term, but a guileless celebration of what remained. And it made me think differently about the comb over, to think of it that way,
Do you have any
sweet?
Do you have any advice? I don't know if we have the students still in the room, but do you have any advice for writers, since it is a gift of yours, of how to look at a character or a person and really see them and describe them?
What's coming to mind first is pay attention to the world around you. I honestly think that is that's the thing I hold most dear in terms of skill. Craft can be learned. There are writers who give craft talks. I don't give craft talks because some of my craft, it's almost like it would feel sacrilegious to speak it out loud, because once I am in very serious engagement with what I'm describing and I can really see it, almost all of my technical problems fall away. And I think that this is true for all writers. And it's really about learning and practicing a very granular attention. Some of us may do it naturally, but when I was younger, when I was traveling, and I still do this to some degree, if there's 10 miles between two towns and I want to go to the next town, I will go there on foot and I will look at every single thing I see along the way. Instead of slowing time down to steal a terrine that tastes like cat food, which French people pretend does not taste like cat food, I slow time down to learn how to see very minor, subtle things that I might otherwise miss.
Yeah. Okay, so we were talking about it earlier. There's this scene where Sadie, probably after drinking and driving, goes to the back of a parking lot.
Oh, she's definitely drunk in that
She's drunk.
scene. Yeah.
She goes to the back of a parking lot, empty parking lot, and where truckers usually park, and starts peeing.
Yeah.
And as she's peeing, she's looking at this
She calls
bush.
it making beer.
Right. She's looking at these orange panties in a bush, peeing, and she's thinking about what she calls the real Europe, and goes into this long description of the truck driver's life. And you quote a Moldovan truck driver saying, making beer. And I wondered about that. How did you know about the life of a Moldovan truck driver?
Well, so I spend a lot of time in France, and the book is set in a part of France that I know very well.
Yeah.
I fictionalized it. I call the region the Guyenne, which is a word I borrowed from a name that previously was used for a large swath of Lower France, up until, as I understand it, the French Revolution. And it was kind of like a hint for French friends who've read it. It's coming out in France in January. That'll be interesting to see what happens there. But for French friends who've read it, they understand that it sort of points to, it could be the Dordogne, it could be the Lot, it could be the Corrèze, it could be the Aude, it could be the Lozère. And these all happen to be places that I know pretty well. My husband translates French philosophy. Our son is bilingual and now works as he's a teenager, but he spent the last 2 summers working as a caving guide in a quite remote area on the border between the Lot and the Dordogne. And so I know I know this other France. I know both what people think of as La France profonde, like the deep France, the France of peasant revolts, 17th century peasant revolts, the France of the French resistance, the France where people's first language is not French, it's Occitan, or another language of the Languedoc. I know farmers who speak Occitan, at home with their family, and that's the language in which they were raised. I mean, up through World War I, as the joke goes, the commander would yell "charge," and half the French soldiers would look at each other like, "What the hell did he just say?" Because people spoke so many different languages. It's a confederated place originally of many different cultures. But among all those different cultures, like the smallest unit of French culture would be the bocage, the hedgerow, your own hedgerow. And people would spend their whole lives really only knowing their hedgerow and maybe one or two beside it. But now France is an industrialized country with major heavy industry. It is a place of nuclear power plants, of autoroutes that, as I understand it, are largely built by the European Union. And this is also France on some level. Sadie goes on this sort of obnoxious disquisition where she says, though panties on a bush and truck ruts, that's the real Europe. And then she says, the real France is highways and nuclear power plants. And like those men you see on the side of the highway wearing state worker uniforms with the kind of reflective band around the cuff. She's like, that is Europe. But there is no one real Europe. Yeah. All of these different places coincide as contradictory planes of reality, that are nonetheless one and the same place. Yeah. So I guess it's spending time in, that these kind of crannies of very special locality where people farm still now like they did 600 years ago, and also spending time on the auto route, where the contradiction kind of verges onto one plane, because near the cashier at the auto route, they're selling local products so that you could buy mustard and truffles and products made of lavender that come from the monasteries. As Sadie jokes, like, it's almost like the monks worshipped lavender instead of God. But the localized products are being sold in these generic truck stops that look the same everywhere you go on every auto route.
Let's talk a little bit about, there's several ideas or recurring themes, I guess, I would say, throughout the book. And one of them, we kind of talked about it when she was complaining about being touched by that man, is the idea of salt. And know your salt. And opinions are one thing, but salt is another. Do you want to read this section? And then let's talk about where the idea came from, why.
Yeah, sure. Human salt, like this salt, is everlasting. Oh, she's in Cardona, if anybody knows this town in northern Spain where there's a mountain of salt that is actually ever growing. It's coming from way underground and is self-replenishing. Also, do people know that the term salary originates, the root of it is salt, because soldiers were paid in salt. That's how valuable it was. Human salt, like this salt, is everlasting. Mine it, use it, and it will not deplete. In my own salt, my own core, this is what I knew. Life goes on a while, then it ends. There is no fairness. Bad people are honored, and good ones are punished. The reverse is also true. Good people are honored, and bad people are punished. And some will call this grace or the hand of God instead of luck. But deep down, even if they lack the courage to admit it, inside each person they know that the world is lawless and chaotic and random. This truth is stored in their salt. Some have access, others don't. A gift or a curse that my salt is right here with me all the time. A gift. I'd rather be driven by immutable truths than the winds of some opinion whose real function is to underscore a person's social position in a group, a belief without depth. These boys in the library, she's talking about the Moulinar, would profess to share beliefs, but eventually they might become enemies of those beliefs of one another. They will adopt new beliefs, new personas. It is better to be steadfast. Me, I adhere to my salt. I draw strength from it, use it. I keep watch over my salt, and when it serves me, I keep watch over other people's salt. I mine my salt, and sometimes I mine the salt of others, which is to say, I cooperate with the part of them that they can't reach, are not in touch with, cannot see, but that sometimes, when I'm lucky, I can see quite well. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that Sadie, gets away with things, because there is a counter voice to this very point in the novel, which is Bruno, who sees people as fundamentally good. She's basically like retranslating Ecclesiastes there, as I see it. Like I was reading Ecclesiastes when I wrote this novel, partly because I worship Marguerite Duras. She's sort of my big daddy in a way. And in one of her books, she says, like, I'm only reading 3 things. And it's like my own work. What else was it? Proust, which I also happen to love, and Ecclesiastes. And when you read Ecclesiastes, for those who know it, it's a quite severe and stern conception of human reality. Ecclesiastes says that a bad person will be honored with a beautiful funeral, and a good person will die in the street. And I thought, this is something that Sadie will connect to and will point to. See, it's not just me who is insisting on a pessimism. And I think that some of her insistence is meant to explain away the fact that she deliberately harms other people, which, personally, I try to take the Hippocratic Oath daily. But so she's sort of saying, you see, whereas Bruno's conception of people is also abstracted from the political sphere. This part with assault starts because Sadie is in a room with these young people who are the communards, and she's sort of saying their insistence on defining themselves for one another and alone as a social identity and as an ego formation, she sees as a kind of performance, both for other people and for themselves. And she says, underneath all the personas and guises, who are they in their 4 a.m. version? Sort of when you have to face your own self in a denuded state. I think everyone is quite vulnerable in that 4 a.m. self. And she says, underneath all the guises in that space, they may have some idea of right and wrong. They may have some sense of how life should be lived, but it isn't the political daytime identity. And I think there is some truth to that. I mean, we're in a space right now where I can get through life breaking bread with people and hugging them regardless of who they voted for. Because for a lot of people, that level of abstract politics is not part of their daily life. And they still care about things that I care about. Bruno is somebody who believes that he's sort of almost on the other side of the political and has this sense that people have within them a fundamental kernel of something like innocence. And he says, all savagery extends from power. And if you treat people with grace and humanity and gentleness, they will exhibit those traits in kind. Maybe it's a sort of romantic idea, but I have seen people in real life like Bruno who are possessed with a kind of preternatural gentleness, and it can be very activating to those around them. So maybe ultimately he activates Sadie, if no one else in the book.
Right. Yeah, she's reading his emails throughout the whole book, and she does seem to be drawn to him and softened by him and maybe ultimately transformed by him, even going to his property and peeking into the cave where she thinks he lives.
She realizes at a certain point that this guy has no idea that she exists.
Yeah.
Even as she sort of, without admitting it to the reader, is almost like volunteering for the job of being his spiritual daughter.
Yeah.
So she goes to the land. She figures out, because she has the dossiers, and she can, the world for her is illuminated in a way that almost like some of us are led to believe in the way that the internet functions, that you can look everything up on Google now,
Yeah.
Sadie can see things other people can't. So she knows the GPS coordinates of Bruno's property, and she follows his daughter there, and then she goes there herself, but she doesn't even know if it's really his property. And then she runs into a man on the side of the road, and I want to give it away,
Yeah.
but she thinks maybe it's Bruno, but she's not sure. And I think the fact that she wants to have an encounter with him forces upon her an encounter with herself,
Right.
most importantly, because who is this woman and what are her actual desires?
Right.
We don't really know, and I don't think she really knows either, since she's just this series of aliases.
Yeah. What caught me off guard when we were talking earlier was I was asking you what parts of yourself were in Sadie, and you said, well, more of me is in Bruno. I have a few more questions, but
Yeah.
really we're getting close to the hour. If there are any questions that you have? We have somebody with the microphone. If you want to go ahead and stand up, they'll come to you.
Hi.
Hi.
I'd like to say hi to Rachel because I'm Susan Julovitz and I'm Heidi's mom. And Heidi said to say hi.
Oh my gosh. the very, very talented writer, Heidi Julovitz.
And she says the same about you. But I do have a question which I didn't originally think I was going to ask. But when you're describing Sadie and you're describing Bruno, and I don't know that I agree with like everything that Autumn is saying,
Yeah.
because I see Bruno as a person of depth, and I saw in Bruno time and space outward and space inward. And I see Sadie as somebody who thinks she knows everything and sees everything, but really operates on a plane
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
No, I agree completely. In fact, I sort of thought I had maybe made that clear. But so Bruno, to me, is the main character of the novel. He's also the heart of the novel, from my conception. I mean, he's somebody who's looking for answers to where humanity, in his conception, took a kind of wrong turn. And, when you talk to people who believe that maybe the contemporary version of capitalism in which we live is not a wholesome, fruitful, stable social organization, people tend to point to the agricultural revolution as having sort of been the beginning of the closing of the commons. And, this is generally considered to be sort of like, was that the best thing for people? Bruno takes the wrong turn back 38,000 years, as if to say, once upon a time in Europe and Asia and North Africa, people lived in very small communities. They slept for very long stretches. He sort of has a sort of romantic conception of the Neanderthal versus the Homo sapien. The Homo sapien, he concedes, yes, made beautiful art on the cave walls of places like Lascaux and Chauvet. But in fact, as Bruno says, when you really look at these drawings, Homo sapien has chosen to exclusively depict eating and killing, which to his mind only reconfirms what he describes as a growth at any cost mindset. Whereas the Neanderthal makes abstract art. And if you read books by anthropologists about Neanderthal dig sites and what they have discovered, they have discovered caches of art at this point, but it's almost exclusively abstract, kind of geometric art, like lines and crosses on bone and on rocks. And I side with Bruno in a way in his interest in the underdog. It's like, I grew up in a world where people use the term Neanderthal in a pejorative sense. And I always kind of felt like the poor Neanderthal, like just not being able to hack it doesn't mean you're less than, right? So he's always looking for ways to sort of re-embrace the Neanderthal as maybe being like subtly superior, but not in a way that would allow him, to run the distance and outrun the like Homo sapien, he says, had a better build for warmer climates once Europe thawed after the Ice Age. But then he describes the Homo sapiens limbs as being breadstick, and also says the Homo sapien used a long-range throwing javelin, which was much more practical for large game, but didn't have the same sort of romantic, brave commitment to gore that the short-range thrusting spear had. Like, if you're going to kill an animal, be in total acknowledgement that you must pass through death in order to come back to life and eat that animal. So he has these sort of romantic notions, but also he lives in a cave underground, and the book was set in an area that is entirely subtended by limestone caves and caverns. And as I mentioned, my son is a guide to the caves, so I hear from him many details about the underground world, but I also regularly take paths that go underneath a limestone shelf where you can feel like you're walking through people's rooms, and that these are places where people have been walking for 1 million years, and you can feel this sense of human presence. I had this image of Bruno when I was first starting to write the book, of a man pressing his ear to the rock wall of a cave and hearing what sounded to him like shortwave radio transmissions, but were in fact the susurrations of previous waves of humanity, as though if clues had been left, if illuminations had been left for us on how to proceed, they could be divinated underground. And I conceived of him as somebody who sees the cave as a place where all planes of reality converge onto one plane of reality. And I really wanted to think into that in a way that wasn't a ridicule of those kinds of ideas. It's a sort of homespun philosophy, and he's producing myths to some degree. But myths are also real, which is something I've thought about more since writing the book. Like, when we learn myths as a child, we know the Greek myths, for instance, aren't real, but they serve a real purpose. And even very young children understand that. And what purpose do they serve? They resolve some contradiction or failure socially or historically. And I feel Bruno did that for me in terms of acknowledging this question that we're careening toward extinction in the driverless car. It was quite healing for me to have a character who could ask that and to think into how we exit the car. So yeah, to me, he's the heart of the book, and thank you for asking that. Any other? Yeah, right over here.
So I haven't read the book yet, but I'm curious about the title.
That's a good question.
Because everything you've said doesn't really illuminate the title so far.
Well, so Creation Lake, Bruno does say at one point, actually it's a passage I often read, he talks about the human community in the earth, and he talks about going underground and how for 9/10 of human time, people lived in cognizance in relationship to the underground world. People have always gone underground. But this other 10th of time that he refers to is the industrialization of the earth, which is all about the above ground. I was born in 1968. The early 70s was the decade of the skyscraper. That was when they built the Twin Towers. It's like World War II was the time of aerial footage, of going up to, the outer atmosphere of the earth, going beyond it. It was all about the above. And he says, we understand the above. It's it's the technological imagination of modern man is the above the ground, the way above the ground, and then outer space, beyond our galaxy and beyond. But there's another whole world. The other half of life goes very, very deep as well. And he says people who build bunkers to prepare for some apocalyptic time are not engaging in this deep tradition of the human community in the earth. Because when you pour concrete and envision a time when you will survive mass death, you cannot hear the human community in the earth, the susurrations in the lake of our creation. So he has a line about the lake of our creation. And there is a subplot in the book, but quite important strand about the question of water, because the farmers are losing access to the water that the French state wants to suck out of the water table and store in huge plastic-lined bays. I borrowed that from reality. They're called in France mega basins. And when I finished writing the book, this had erupted into a huge scandal in France where farmers in the north, which is not the area where I set the book, have been engaging in pitched battles with the police over the question of mega basins. And Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, tried to go to the big agricultural fair outside of Paris right before my book was published in late August. The book came out September 3rd. And he was prevented from going by farmers who put hay bales on the main autoroute and set them on fire and blocked the road with tractors. And so it's like sometimes reality and the thing you've invented coincide. But so water is one of the things I'm referring to with Creation Lake. But also Sadie is this sort of individual who believes that she can get by on endless recreations, self-creations. So there's the question of persona and personality and selfhood there as well. I don't know, it just seemed to fit the book. It comes from outside the book. You won't find that phrase, Creation Lake, in the book. But it also kind of sounded like the Hardy Boys to me. Like, it's a place you could go, you know, where's Creation Lake? So then my publisher made these hats, but they only made 30 of them for influencers that said Creation Lake. And the joke was like, where is that, you know? Thank you for that question.
Yeah, we probably have one last question.
If I don't answer your question and you buy a book, I'm happy to answer your question, which is not a quid pro quo, but should you buy one, I'm happy to answer questions at the signing table.
Thank you for your book. You mentioned Bruno is the heart of the story. I really enjoyed essentially the emails, seeing them through Sadie's voice, through Sadie's eyes. I'm just curious why you chose that route. I'm really interested versus him being perhaps first person, or if you could just speak to why you chose that manner of presenting him.
Yeah, it's a great question. I wanted to have a novel that only had one narrator. It's like I've written books with ensemble narrators. In fact, all of my novels have had multiple narrators. And I wanted to do something sort of classical, borrowing certain dimensions of the noir genre, where she would be the storyteller. And yet, the first two lines that I wrote are the first two lines of the book. Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. He said they were prone to addiction too, and especially smoking. And that's Bruno speaking. But I realized as I wrote the lines that she is transposing his communications so that the reader only has access to them through her. And sometimes it's the formal stricture and the challenge of that stricture that is generative for the writer, at least in my case. I knew that it would be a challenge to have two storytellers inside of one voice, but it was also the thing that sort of set off the green light, what drag racing, what they call the Christmas tree, you know? It's like, it turned green. Sorry, there I am with my like metaphors of motor stuff, but I just wrote an 11,000 word essay about drag racing. It'll be in Harper's Magazine next month. That was the thing that just created this sense of velocity for me. And then once I had her having access to his emails and this incantatory, Bruno said, he told them, it was just so fun for me that I wrote the whole book in 14 months, whereas I had been working on it and framing it out and thinking about it for 3.5 years, but really knew I would end up writing a book like this since 2008. So it'd been a long time coming, and it was only at telling Bruno through her that it sort of worked for me. I can't say exactly why, but it was this maybe the tension between the two. I also had just reread Pale Fire by, Nabokov, and that opens with his character, Charles Kinbote, analyzing this long poem by this poet, John Shade, and maybe it kind of gave me a bit of permission to do two voices in one. And you're stuck with Charles Kinbote, who is a total lunatic, right? And he's representing himself quite differently than he really is. He says he's a prince from the nation of Zembla, but it turns out that he's in a motel next to an amusement park. And I think that maybe that was like exciting to me, or it just, it gave me even further permission to do things that way. I mean, sometimes it's just, you have to do them how you do them. It's like instinct alone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Autumn.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Autumn. That was fascinating. Thank you again to Rick Wilson, David Trachtenberg, Cheryl, and Peter Teague for underwriting this session. And to buy a book of Rachel's and ask her a question, you're going to go straight out to the courtyard, and that's where Buxton Pop-Up Book is. So thank you again for both of you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.